This week on the Inked Well, we're taking a look at two inks from Anderillium ink. This is Colossal Squid Dark. Now you may be asking yourself, why two bottles? Well, there's a good reason. This bottle is the wet variant, and the other bottle is the dry variant of the exact same ink. That's right, two different flow types for the same ink. So that does beg the question, why two different flow types for the same color? Well, Anderillium believes that you shouldn't have to choose which pen to put an ink in. You should choose the ink to fit whatever pen you want. And with that, you get a wet and dry variant of all 8 inks that Anderillium makes. Yes, they only make 8 inks, but that's because they're a relatively new company out of Tampa, Florida. Now, to see how well these inks behave, we're going to be using two rather interesting pens of mine. These are the Benu Briolette with a medium nib, and the Benu Graceful Chameleon, also with a medium nib. I chose these two pens after using Pelikan Edelstein Topaz in them and noticing that the line variation, the shading, the sheen was spot on from both nibs. So I can use two different pens with each one having a different flow rate and give you a pretty good result of what we're going to be looking at. So the Briolette there is going to have the wet ink, and the dry ink is going to go in the Graceful Chameleon here. Now let's go ahead and talk color for a few seconds, and for that, we're going to go ahead and take a look at our coloring swabs. Now, with a name like Colossal Dark, you know we're going to be looking at a blue-black, and that's exactly what we get here. Now, the wet ink does have a little bit more shading characteristics to it, whereas the dry is kind of just a flat blue-black. But you can see when I compare it to Noodler's USS Texas that we get a very similar shading profile from light to dark that we get on the wet sample. So honestly, I would say these inks are kind of spot on with each other, but USS Texas does tend to be a little bit darker. It's a nice shade of blue though, and you've got to give it credit for that. But I will be talking about one other similarity to Noodler's a little bit later, and it's not necessarily a good one. So let's see how Colossal Dark handles itself on Tomoe River paper. Now, granted, you have to be a pretty horrible ink to mess up on Tomoe, but let's see what we get. Now, looking at the samples, you can tell that as far as what you're going to get from the pen, you actually do get a little bit more shading variance in the drier ink sample, and I think that's mainly due to the fact that unless you're writing with a gusher, the drier writing sample is going to be drier from the nib, so you're going to get a little bit more variant. Whereas the wet sample tends to just kind of be flat, which is exactly opposite of what we got in the swab. Now the cool thing though, the dry time for both of these inks is sub 20 seconds on Tomoe River paper, which is really fast, especially when you're stacking it up against better known brands like Diamine, Pelikan, or Colorverse for that matter. And I mean, when you look at the dry sample, you're looking at sub 15 seconds for a dry time. And when you look at the wet sample, you're still sub 20 seconds. And that's saying something. That's actually really good. And for that, I really have to give Anderillium credit, because to get really good dry time from both variants here, that's actually a really good job. So that's 1 point in its favor. So looking at the color variants here, on the wetter sample, the nib marks are actually kind of lost. It's just a fade on the color. I mean, the light and the dark is still there, but there's no real nib definition, whereas on the drier sample, you can almost see each individual line from the nib as I was putting the color on the paper. And if you look at the ink splotches, there's not really any sheen there. There's some deep shading, but it kind of just fades to black. There's not really anything I would call sheen. So let's go ahead and finish up the writing sample by putting a swab of each variant onto the Tomoe River paper. And let's also see if it bleeds through to the page behind it. So while filming me does the swab, speaking me is going to go ahead and let you in on something. You may notice I'm doing this review gloveless. I've made a couple modifications on some stuff to go ahead and try to control the nerve damage in my right and left hands that cause my hands to shake. We'll see how it goes. So far, the results are pretty good, but I want to give it a fair shake, so I figured I'd go gloveless on the next few reviews, and if it works, it sticks. Now, getting back to the ink, you can tell it's kind of reminiscent of an oil slick, or like when a cartoon octopus inks in the water. It's very dark and just very in your face. Now, we did keep with the theme, so dry is on the left and wet is on the right. And the funny thing is, the wet ink does appear to be drying much quicker than the dry ink. And I'm going to admit, I'm not a chemist, and I don't know the first thing about fountain pen ink chemistry, so I've got no clue why that is. But I do like that you do get some pretty good shading on the wet sample from lighter to dark. And it's also pretty interesting that the lighter portions of each sample are already pretty dry. If the darker parts actually dry just as quick on both the wet sample and on the dry sample, I can just shut this without getting any on the other page there. Let's go ahead and take a look and see how much of this bled through. And as you can see, even with how saturated it is, it didn't bleed through, which is kind of interesting. I was expecting a lot more bleed, especially with, you can tell on the show through there, the wetter ink shows through a lot. And the dry ink does have a little bit of show through, so I was expecting some of that swab to actually come through onto the next page. So definitely a good job there. Another point in the ink's favor. I mean, on Tomoe River paper, a lot of inks have pretty massive show through, so you're really only going to be writing on one page. But to keep it to that one page, that's a pretty good mark. And as you can see, the two swabs are almost dry. We're just waiting for that last little bit. So while we wait for those two samples to dry, let's go ahead and move over to the writing sample. Before we do though, I'm going to show you that thing that this ink shares with Noodlers that isn't quite good. If you look here, you can see feathering. It's happening on Rhodia dot pad. Now, it handles itself pretty well on the dry sample, but you do get it on the Rhodia, and the show through on the Rhodia is a little bit more than I would like from that wet sample. So definitely, if you're going to write on Rhodia, go dry. If you're writing on Tomoe, you can use either wet or dry. It's entirely up to you. Now let's go ahead and dip into the water. So diving in, you can see we're putting a rather considerable amount of water on there. And this is not looking too good. I mean, it's kind of holding its definition, but any feathering that was starting on this paper is continuing in force, and that's not a good thing. I mean, it's holding its color really, really well, I'll give it that, but it's not holding its definition. So if we were going to give the water test a 1 out of 5, it'd literally be a 1 out of 5. An ink that holds its color is one thing, but it has to hold its definition. Like, I can tell by the outlines of the letters what I wrote there, but it feathered something fierce. So I give it the 1 for the fact that I can recover what I wrote. But if it was even just a small spill and this happened, I mean, you saw how much ink came up from the wet sample. The dry sample released some ink, but didn't release nearly as much. So if you're writing with the wet version of the ink, be prepared for the ink to get everywhere in a spill situation. And I kind of do mean everywhere. So while the writing is still somewhat legible, and yes, it stayed pretty nice and dark on the paper, when we look at the back side of the paper, that tells the entire story. If you're going to be writing in a wet environment, use the dry ink, or you may actually have a bad time, which for me means I need to clean my desk really quick and get the excess from the wet sample off the desk. So I'm not going to do my normal handwritten overall that I do. This one just gets a 4.5 out of 10. It performs really well on Tomoe River paper, but there's more papers out there, and we need to get that same consistency that we get from Tomoe on Rhodia and on Clairefontaine. The colors are good. They could be enhanced a little, but they're good colors overall. And I think for a young company, if they take the constructive criticism from the community in stride, then Anderillium can use that to grow and create a really strong line of inks that any fountain pen user would be proud to put in any of their pens. So if you're like me and you use Tomoe for the majority of your writing, both flows are fair game. But if you use any other type of paper, you may want to stick with the dry variant. Other than that though, thank you guys for watching this video. Subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, follow the channel on Twitter and Instagram at The Inktwell, and support the channel at patreon.com/theinktwell. That's going to do it for me this week. I'll see you next time.